Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our show. I'm Sister Vassa, and today I am here with two dear friends of mine, Professor George Demacopoulos and Professor Aristotle Papanikolaou of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center of Fordham University in New York City, New York. Could both of you please say hello to our viewers?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us, Sister Vassa.
Well, thank you for agreeing to come on the show, my friends. We want to discuss a certain opinion that's been floating about on at least part of the Orthodox internet, that your Orthodox Christian Studies Center is accommodationist, quote unquote. So this characterization has been offered for what you do at Fordham in the area of higher education and Orthodox theology. And so I'd like to talk about it. So I'd like to ask you first, George, to simply tell us, for the folks at home who might not know, what the Orthodox Christian Studies Center does, and then we'll get to the whole issue of accommodationism.
Thank you, Sister. The Orthodox Christian Studies Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on Orthodox Christian studies broadly understood. So a lot of what we do is theological, but we take a holistic view, and we invest in research in Orthodox history, political science, anthropology, and so forth. A lot of what we do is to fund academic conferences, research fellowships, and so forth. Probably the thing we are most known for, however, is not that kind of high-end academic work, but it is an online publication known as Public Orthodoxy, in which we invite scholars from around the world with various expertise to offer op-ed-like commentaries on a variety of issues affecting the church in the world and so forth.
I see. And both of you are Orthodox Christians.
Yes, we're both Orthodox Christians. We were both raised in the church. Telly's father was a rather famous priest in Chicago. My father-in-law was a priest for 50 years in New Jersey. So we're both graduates of the Orthodox Seminary. We are about as Orthodox as it gets.
All right. I didn't realize all of us are practically priest kids. My dad was a priest as well. So you do teach, right, and share knowledge about Orthodox theology within the framework of Orthodox teaching of the Creed, for example. Could you tell us, please, whether or not you feel bound by the dogmatic teachings of the Orthodox Church?
Yeah, well, so of course, personally, yes, absolutely, right. I recite the creed. I believe in the creed. I'm so invested in this. I've spent my entire life studying the church fathers and the tradition of the church and so forth. I mean, teaching at Fordham. Fordham, if you don't know, is a Roman Catholic school in the Jesuit tradition. Every undergraduate at Fordham, unlike at a state school, has to take 2 courses in theology. And what's so great about our center, because we attract a lot of Orthodox students to Fordham, is they are allowed to then take their 2 courses in theology in Orthodox theology. So I routinely teach courses called, for example, Byzantine Christianity, Women of the Christian East, Christian Thought and Practice. Telly teaches courses on Orthodox systematic theology, modern Orthodox thinkers, and so forth. And so both our personal commitments to the faith and our teaching reflects the Orthodox tradition.
Okay, so thank you for that. Telly, do you want to chime in at this point?
I do think the center, both personally and the center itself, is absolutely committed to the dogmatic tradition, and we consider the dogmatic tradition non-negotiable. Our center does like to create a space for conversation, but I mean, we do draw the line, and the line is at the dogmatic tradition. So we have, as maybe most of your viewers know, we have a forum called Public Orthodoxy, and if someone wanted to write something for us that basically tried to argue against the divinity of Christ, we wouldn't publish it. So there are limits, right? I mean, we do want a conversation, but there are some things that we think are off the table in terms of conversation, and that is the
Right.
dogmatic tradition of the church. And, you know, the word accommodationist is an interesting word within the Christian lexicon of the 20th century. A very famous Protestant thinker named H. Richard Niebuhr of the Niebuhr clan, so to speak, as maybe some of your viewers know, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was very famous and on the cover of Time magazine way back when. Excuse me. So H. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book called Christ and Culture, and he had these 5 typologies, and one of them was Christ of culture. And this was his way of basically saying that, you know, one approach is basically that, you know, you sort of revise what you think Christianity is and your Christian teachings in light of sort of cultural shifts, perhaps shifts. For example, one cultural shift could be rather than seeing the cosmos in a spherical, you know, Aristotelian spherical sense, that you see it in a more Newtonian kind of sense, right? So, I mean, again, this revision of teachings in order to maybe accommodate changing worldviews. So, if accommodation is meant in that sense, then it's just strange, because right here on this program, I believe I can speak for George and he can nod, we absolutely affirm as authoritative scripture, tradition in its wider sense, which includes fathers, all the councils of the church, the dogmatic tradition, the liturgies, icons, sacraments. Am I missing some of the canons of the church? We absolutely 100% affirm, follow. We
Billy, could you just mention also, I happen to know this about you, aren't you a cantor in church?
right. Byzantine tradition. I mean, I love Byzantine music, and hope that it could be a little bit more diffuse, you know, without upending in any way the tradition of church music that has developed here in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, of which I'm a part of. So I you know, and that's kind of an interesting thing, because there are some people within the church that call me a traditionalist in that sense, because I do affirm Byzantine music and some other aspects of the church. And
Yes, and I know that you have taught others this tradition that is usually
correct.
handed over or handed on by a real master. So I just want, because I'm a liturgist and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. And
Yeah,
if I had some,
I know some.
if I had some CDs, this would be the point where I would try to plug my CDs. But I
Yeah,
don't have any. I don't have any CDs. But I just want to end here by saying that I don't understand that. I mean, if the culture is such where it's harder for people to really make sense of these dogmatic traditions, to really accept them, to believe in them, to I don't know. I mean, that it strikes me that our affirmation of all those things, both personally and as a center, actually, um, the word accommodationist doesn't quite fit. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about what might be meant by that. And I think what might be meant by that is that we do allow a space, though, for discussion of certain issues that seem to be hot topics within the culture today. And I think that there are people who within the Orthodox Church that perhaps would expand this non-negotiable label, for example, or zone to some issues, to those particular kinds of issues. And that's where we theologically disagree, right? We disagree on theological grounds, not on cultural, not in any way attempt to be culturally relevant or culturally culturally cool, or culturally trying to get some kind of cultural affirmation. We just try to, based on theological grounds that we share with others, we make an argument that there are certain issues that that are allowed to be discussed within the church and explored, and perhaps the culture itself provokes those questions. But just because the culture provokes those questions doesn't mean we're being accommodationist, because if that were the case, then all the fathers of the church would be accommodationists, because in fact, it was the pagan culture that provoked many of the questions that they had to confront. Never did the fathers say, well, that's coming from a pagan, so I don't have to deal with it. They would never, Justin Martyr, for example, never sort of encountered questions like that.
Right.
And so I think that the word accommodationist is a little bit strange, because in the sense it doesn't quite fit. In many ways, people from the culture would consider us conservative.
Yes.
Yeah, but to be precise, I think it has something to do with the fact that we allow discussion over certain kinds of questions. And I think the heart of our perhaps difference, internal difference, and maybe that's one of the questions we can talk about too, is what is the how much difference is allowed within the church. I think the difference really is about what are we allowed to talk about and what are we not allowed to talk about.
Yes, thank you for sharing those thoughts, Telly. I'm thinking about also the question of simply having different vocations within all of that, as in Niebuhr's, different models of how this could work, the way, Christ and civilization, just how, I'm thinking how, uh, I think in perhaps the, Florovsky's well-known article, like the Empire and the Desert, one, he touches a little bit on this tension between those who decide to flee to the desert, and some today would say, oh, that's sort of like, in a sense, Benedict option, to completely form your own community and flee. And that's a choice, right? How to deal with this world. So uh, I think that that's a question of vocation, not of just a historical time period. I think there have always been people who were more comfortable fleeing, than dealing with. And then there were various other vocations that had to do with dealing with the church in this world, because the church is left in this world. In John 17, the Lord prays to the Father, saying, I do not ask that you take them out of this world, but sanctify them in your truth. So some people feel that they have to be armed with the gospel of peace, right? As in Ephesians 6, and with all of the rest of it, and with the word, and being sanctified by truth, and somehow spread it, right, in this world. So I'm just chiming in here that there were always those, even kicking and screaming, that didn't want to say become bishops, like in like a Chrysostom or an Athanasius, but had that vocation. And so even Palamas, who's best known for his hesychasm, spent more than half of his life, as I said in an old video of mine about his life, in the center of the political turmoil of his time and in a city, right? So
Right.
he had that vocation. And today, who is going to teach the young people or the future priests, and also to deal with some of these not black and white questions, right? But I find that because of the internet age, because things that used to be only spoken about in academic settings, right? They are discussed before a broader audience. And I think that some people get scandalized, and are quick. This is the part that I'd like to talk more about. And I want to say this really from the bottom of my heart, that I I think something is going wrong when we observe someone with a different vocation in this whole area. Say, if I'm someone who has chosen to flee, or I have the vocation to stay in the empire and not to go to the desert. I think something is going very wrong when we point fingers at the other side or try to damage their vocation, what they're doing, or to cast this shadow on what they're doing, or to even announce, stay away from those people. Stay away from them because they're not doing what we're doing. And we have this suspicious attitude towards their very orthodoxy, even if the people are saying, no, I believe, I believe in the creed and one God, I believe all these things. And they say, no, you don't, because you're talking about this, that, and the other thing. Why have we ceased to trust one another? And how in our very, relatively speaking, small Orthodox theological, community, how is this happening that we are engaged in some kind of culture wars against one another? So I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about this culture of considering someone contaminating. And could either of you please speak more about, in the age, say, of the, let's say, the Cappadocian fathers, but you could talk about other fathers if you'd like. How, you know, how do you think traditionally the Orthodox Church would see perceiving as contaminating, someone of a different vocation? Say even monastics in the wilderness, when they had lay people coming in droves to them, right?
Right.
Anyway, speak to this whole thing about the contaminating aspect.
Okay, so I've so many thoughts about this. Let me begin with the issue of vocation, and then I'm going to go specifically to your question of the desert versus the empire and that sort of thing. So I think the issue of vocation is really, really important. Archbishop Demetrius, the former Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church in America, was an extraordinary supporter of the center that we have at Fordham, and really helped us launch it. And the last time I was in his presence, before he retired, I was giving a lecture at a parish, and he chose to introduce me rather than the priest. And he knew he's very aware of what's going on in the world. And he knows that our center is criticized because we are willing to host academic conferences on tough questions, and we're willing to ask things that people think we shouldn't talk about, or so forth or so on. And so he's saying this to a parish environment, right? So half the people there had no idea who I was, right? And yet he said, but let me tell you, it is their vocation to ask the questions that no one else wants to ask, right? He spoke of that language, right? That it is like, this is the role of a professor, right? This is the role of a scholar, to ask the questions that nobody wants to ask. Now, as to your juxtaposition between the person who flees and goes into the desert and the person who remains and tries to engage the culture around them, I have a couple thoughts about that. The first is, obviously, you're right. There is that dichotomy. But as a historian of the ancient church, I'd like to say that in many ways, it was more a rhetorical dichotomy than a historical one. Because even those people who went into the desert almost always remained actively engaged through correspondence with the people on the outside. Perhaps the single greatest failing of the Benedict option presentation is that Benedict himself is the absolute worst example, to like the historical Benedict, to identify someone who like set himself off from the world and didn't engage, right? It is factually untrue, right? I mean, it is true that he established communal monasteries, and it is true that those monasteries served as a preservation for culture and literacy and so forth. But it is factually untrue that he left because the pagans had taken over from Rome. That's just not true. And it's factually untrue that he didn't engage them. In fact, if you read his life that was written by St. Gregory the Great, half of Benedict's miracles occur with him going outside of the monastery and healing pagans. Right?
Right. No, but George, I would say it's true for women. We don't hear women keeping in touch. I know that they don't count.
Right. No, you have, well,
they really don't count because they don't have a voice at that time, by and large. And once they were not having babies, then they definitely were, and off.
Unless they had extraordinary financial means, like the Melanias or Olympias or something like that, they were engaged. But no, that's a point well taken. But let me shift to the Cappadocians, right? And how did they respond to this?
I think it holds true that it does hold true that some people disengage, right? Not everybody. I mean, that engagement requires education and the ability to write.
Yes.
So that actually narrows the circle, really, of people who could do that that throughout the ages. It was not many people, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So as it happens, I'm giving a lecture this Saturday at the invitation of Archbishop O.P. the Photo. So I'm giving the Three Hierarchs lecture. So every year they do this for Greek Letters Day. And I've decided to speak about St. Gregory the Theologian's engagement with Julian the Apostate. And I'll make this quick, but basically Julian is this mid-4th century emperor who attempts to return the empire to paganism. And he had actually been a classmate of Gregory's. And Gregory is kind of horrified by this because one of the things that Julian does is he passes an edict forbidding Christians to teach in public schools, saying that only Christians only people who share the religious views of pagans can teach pagan literature. And Gregory's horrified by this. And so he has this whole engagement and he kind of shuts that down. And then years later, 30 years later, his good friend, St. Basil the Great, has died. And he goes at the 3rd anniversary of Basil's death, he goes and gives a belated eulogy. He couldn't make the funeral originally. He was in Constantinople. And so he comes and he's giving this eulogy for St. Basil, right? And then he has this aside at the very beginning. And he says, and I take it as a matter of fact that men of good sense understand that our greatest advantage is Hellenistic paedia, right? Meaning Hellenistic education, and meaning secular literature, right? And then he goes on to defend it, right? And to defend why it is that Christians should not only read secular literature and teach secular literature, but be engaged in the secular world. Right. And then the very last line of this digression, he says, in short, we must not dishonor Hellenistic paedia because some Christians like to do so, but rather we should recognize that such men are boorish and uneducated, desiring all others to be as they themselves are in order to hide themselves in plain sight and escape the notice that they lack all culture.
Okay,
right?
Thank you for that, George. That was very enlightening. We know that the fathers definitely, they prided themselves in their education. They received their educations more often than not from pagans. Chrysostom studying under Livanius, a pagan, right, rhetorician.
A pagan who hated Christians.
Yeah, who hated Christians, and the list keeps going on and on of not only in ancient times, did the fathers receive their educations also from heretics, right? Because Chrysostom was also catechized by Theodore of Mopsuestia, so later, condemned for his non-Orthodox views. But we don't think twice about sending our children, say, to non-Orthodox schools, to, say, Catholic schools, I have no problem with that. My father was educated at a fine Catholic school run by the Marist brothers in Shanghai, and he's grateful to them to this day. You know, we are both educated and enlightened by the non-Orthodox in all sorts of ways, but everybody knows this. So the point I'm trying to make is that we inevitably engage the culture, and we live in this world to greater or lesser degrees, but we seem to feel that the most dangerous and contaminating people are in our own midst. And when we have voices saying things like this about other Orthodox thinkers, I'm finding that maybe we could take pause and say, maybe that's not good for us as church. Maybe, you know, even in this pandemic that God has allowed to happen, I'm not saying that God has sent us the pandemic, but in the traditional Christian understanding, you know, in dark periods with national calamities or pandemics and during the plague, Christians have traditionally said, we need to repent. This is a call for us to repent, right? Maybe the symbolism of this pandemic, right, that we are compelled now to consider one another as potentially contaminating, that we are unhappily needing to distance from one another, right? And we're also we're at least experiencing symbols of not having a voice. Are we doing this to one another is what I want to ask anybody and everybody watching this. Maybe we're being called to think twice now and think a little bit at length and deeply about this kind of, you know, this whole business of of despising one another within the Orthodox Church right now, I'm saying, you know, and also, you know, wanting the other side not even to be heard or for there not to be discussions. All right, that's what I wanted to say. Maybe it's a call for us to repent. After we get through this, maybe we could rediscover that someone else's vocation is good. You know, I don't have to be doing exactly what you're doing, you know, and God bless you if you're fleeing and if that's what you need to do, you know, really. Telly?
Well, and at the very least, have the humility to not create us versus them sort of scenarios, but to see what's good in the other, and to even if they disagree, and to see ultimately what's motivating them, because most people are motivated by the fact that they care about something.
Right. You know what? We're running out of time. I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you both so much. Goodbye to everybody at home. See you next
Bye.
time.
Thank you.